On the early hours of April 29th, 1903, the small mining town of Frank had had their silence shattered at 4 in the morning to a rumbling so incredible people were thrown out of their beds. When they emerged from their homes just moments later, they were astonished to find that their neighbors and the other half of the town had been buried under an entire mountain. This is the story of the Frank Slide. Turtle Mountain, which is located in the Crow's Nest Pass region of Alberta, Canada, got its name because of its distinctive shape. From certain angles, the mountain's profile resembles the shape of a turtle's back or a shell. This likeness to a turtle led early settlers and indigenous people in the area to come to know to it as Turtle Mountain. The name stuck, however, as stories were passed down by the First Nations people. Turtle Mountain was known for a more sinister reason. It was known as the mountain that moved and was long revered as a place to stay away from. The claim that the mountain moved may seem a bit ridiculous, but as you'll come to find out, these claims may have held some truth. The indigenous people were known to avoid camping near the mountain at all costs while traveling through the area. They were wary near the mountain, not necessarily from the tales that were told, but because the mountain was large in stature and loomed over an empty valley. However, this would all change when the first settlers in the area discovered large and rich coal deposits. At the time, coal had emerged as the new black gold and was incredibly valuable. This prompted many pioneers to try and get in on this new coal rush, and with word spreading about the discovery of the resource hidden within the Rocky Mountains, more and more people moved out west and made their way into mining towns. Prior to the completion of the railroad, the Crow's Nest Pass was simply used as a way through the mountains to the west coast, leaving most of the area in between largely untouched. In the 1890s, the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed, which allowed trains to pass from the prairies to the east, through the mountains to the west coast. The new railway traveled right through the Crow's Nest Pass, and the area along it began to boom with life. New mining towns started popping up left and right, and now with the direct line of transit to the east, people started to move out west. One entrepreneur at the time was named Henry Frank, and him, along with his business partner, Sam Gabot, had ambitions of starting their own mining town. A few different mines would be opened along with their very own town, with the incredible, original, and unique name of Frank. Most of the mining towns in the area had been started by miners themselves, who settled in the areas next to where the large deposits of coal had been discovered, which ended up growing in population naturally, with other people following along and mining as well. Frank, however, was a bit different. Henry and Sam wanted to jumpstart their new town and came up with a plan to throw a grand opening celebration in the hopes of attracting settlers. On the 10th of September 1901, the town of Frank celebrated their official grand opening. The festival had concerts, sporting events, and a grand feast, all completely free to the visitors who came. The opening ceremony managed to attract a whopping 1,400 visitors. The town had many cottages on display and offered tours of the coal mines in hopes of impressing the visitors who had come and settle in the town. And for the most part, their plan had worked. By 1903, the town of basically nothing had grown to a population of about 600 people and had stores, restaurants, and hotels. The mines had expanded too. The main Frank coal mine was dug as much as 1,300 feet deep into Turtle Mountain. The mining, which took place 24 hours a day in shifts both at day and night, allowed them to export as much as 1,000 tons of coal per day. You see, most of the coal had been forming in the ground long before the mountains had existed, and as the mountains were formed, the veins of coal had begun sloping upwards. This meant that the further in the miners dug, the less coal there was, forcing them to mine upwards and follow the natural curve of the mountain. In order to follow the coal veins, explosives were used to hollow out vertical chambers as much as 400 feet in height to allow further expansion of the mining operation. It was said that coal was flowing out of the mountain like water, and with the occasional tremor shaking loose the mineral deposits, the coal was practically mining itself. The more and more the miners dug, however, the less there was holding up of the already unstable mountain. Days prior to the disaster, the number of tremors had increased. Frames that were built to hold the weight of the mountain were slowly beginning to split. A handful of rocks would occasionally fall from the mountain, although nothing serious. These signs weren't immediately pointing towards danger. The frequency of the movement increasing should have been enough to slow operations. Still, the warnings were ignored and the miners pressed on. It's important to note that although the mining operations were contributing to the instability of the mountain was already known to be unstable. And the main reason for this was the river. The river, while not very large, separated the town of Frank and Turtle Mountain. The river had been flowing for a long time, and this erosion that was caused by the water had been eating away at the base of the mountain. Small tremors and micro rockslides had been the result of nature slowly rearranging the landscape. This is most likely where the stories of the moving mountain originated from, because anyone who would witness the shifting of the rock would be sure to steer clear of the area, knowing that at a moment's notice, things could start moving again. And now, with coal-hungry miners blowing up the caverns inside the mountain, the inevitable collapse was only being accelerated. On the evening of April 28, 1903, the night shift miners were gearing up and getting ready to go to work. At the base of Turtle Mountain, the workers entered the mine, unaware that most of them would be entering for their last time, descending deep into the earth and up into the mountain to extract more coal from the rich seams within. The work was like usual, physically demanding and cramped with dimly lit conditions. Explosives were used to knock away any large chunks of stone, and pickaxes and shovels used to finish separating and collecting the coal. Although, something was off. The usual tremors that would have regularly occurred throughout the night seemed to have subsided. Besides the explosives going off and the banging of tools and machines outside the mine, the mountain was quiet and still. At around 4 a.m., a few of the miners had come out for their breaks and wanted to get some fresh air. The exact number of miners underground at this point is unknown, but we do know that the majority of the night shift workers were still in the mine. At 4:10 in the morning on April 29th, 1903, the final blow to the mountain was delivered. The silence of the night was shattered by a loud rumble. Boulders the size of houses began to tumble down the mountain, and people who were awake immediately knew what was happening. The mountain began to give way, and a flood of limestone began sweeping its way down the mountain towards the town. Some of the rail yard workers who were on a train at the time saw the rockslide quickly coming towards them and raced to get out of the way. Trees were snapped like twigs. Train cars were thrown like toys thousands of feet from the railway. Buildings that were in the path of the slide had been flattened in an instant and buried beneath 100 feet of stone. A young girl who had been sleeping in her bed at the time, named Marianne Lech, awoke flying through the air as the rockslide had launched her from her bed. Amazingly, she survived with serious injury, but was several hundred feet from where she had been sleeping. Her entire family had had their home buried, and her mother managed to dig themselves out of the rubble. Unfortunately, her father, however, did not survive. In the matter of just 90 seconds, close to a quarter of the entire mountain was dropped onto the valley below and buried half the town of Frank. The limestone had slid so far and with such force, it ended up going 500 feet up the mountain across the valley. The Canadian Pacific Railway had been covered by hundreds of feet of rock, and with the early morning train speeding towards the town, it would slam into the wall of limestone unless warned to stop. The rockslide had cut and snapped any remaining telegraph line, and any attempt to warn the oncoming train would be pointless. The crew of one of the trains, who managed to get out of the way just in time, knew that the early morning train would soon be arriving into the town, and so they ran across the rock to the other side, stepping over half-buried homes and people in their way, in order to warn the oncoming train before it was too late. Within just minutes, they managed to stop and save the people on board the train. While the town was trying to put out fires and pull survivors from the rubble, another fight for survival was still taking place. The rockslide had buried the main entrance to the mine, and the river below had cut a new path through the debris and flooded the lower entrance, leaving any miners that were still alive trapped beneath the collapsed mountain. With rescue from the outside being unlikely anytime soon, and all of the ventilation shafts had been buried, meaning that oxygen was slowly being depleted, the surviving miners had no choice but to dig their way out. The main entrance to the mine was covered by 300 feet of rock, which would have been nearly impossible to dig through by hand. The miners came up with a new plan though. Thanks to the vertical coal chambers that had been made, the remaining survivors decided to focus all efforts on digging straight up. After working tirelessly, most of the miners had collapsed. Just before the air in the mine ran out, the miners emerged out the top at 5 p.m., nearly 13 hours after the rockslide. At this point, they could see the full extent of the damage caused by the rockslide. Although they had freed themselves, a new dread filled them of whether or not their families would be okay. Unfortunately, many miners returned to a missing home. Shortly after the slide, fears of another rockslide happening left most people on edge. An emergency was declared and the town was evacuated. Anyone who would attempt to enter the town during this time was considered a looter and would be shot on sight. Once the evacuation had been lifted, people slowly began to re-enter the town. The Turtle Mountain mine wouldn't reopen until about a month afterwards, and workers who returned to the Frank mine were shocked to find one of the workhorses, named Charlie, had managed to survive this entire time underground. Unfortunately, he was in bad shape and did not survive for much longer. There was debate about whether or not the mining operations were directly responsible for the avalanche. Although the mountain was known to move, many people believed the mine was the true cause of the rockslide. After all, the width of the rockslide on the mountain was also the same length of the mine. The railway that had been covered in the rock was promptly dug up to continue its operations, and it still continues its service to this day. The town of Frank was relocated on the north of the railway, and old buildings were demolished. After the slide, the town would not return to what it once was, and although today the town of Frank still exists, the population has since dwindled and the coal mines have long been closed. It's unknown exactly how many people were killed during the rockslide, since people who had survived the incident were swept so far away from their homes. Looking for other bodies would be difficult to locate, not to mention they were already buried beneath a ton of limestone. Those whose bodies weren't recovered are still buried beneath the rock to this day, an estimate close of 100. Today, the Crow's Nest Pass is still used as exactly that. Rock was cleared from the railway and the highway, but the devastation still remains. A tourist center was also opened to preserve the history and educate people on the disaster. Although unlikely, the worry of another rockslide is still possible to this day. The ominous remains from over 100 years ago are still shadowed by half a mountain. If you enjoyed this story, follow along if you want to hear more like this. If you have a suggestion for a topic that you would like to see covered, fill out the form in the description. Thank you for watching, and until next time.